everybody, welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well. Today we're doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw Godzilla x Kong dominate the competition and well defy expectations, including my own. And as I always do, there's always a mea culpa whenever a mistake is made. And the overall projections going into the weekend, especially by the so-called box office experts, were a lot lower than what this film actually ended up doing, especially domestically, where it made $80 million going into the weekend with projections in that $55 to $65 million range. And so very much outdoing that. However, it still does need to be said that the film, though performing very well, is not the best performing of the franchise, and compared to the first film in the MonsterVerse from 2014, it still has a little ways to go if it's going to even come close to reaching those same heights. And even though there is very little competition, historically, these MonsterVerse films have had pretty steep week 2 drop-offs. So will there be able to, be the first MonsterVerse film to have a strong hold because of a lack of competition? Or will we see people kind of just leaving these things behind because overall the reviews for this film are still pretty mixed? Obviously, there are some hardcore fans out there who love everything MonsterVerse who are eating this movie up. There's others like me who are kind of this in-between where I thought the first film was good. I thought Godzilla 2014 was pretty good, entertaining. Loved Godzilla -1, which obviously is not the MonsterVerse itself. And every other film in the MonsterVerse to me has just been a waste of time. But again, that's just my own view on it. And clearly there is an audience. Clearly there is a group of people that want to go see this movie and want to go see and support this franchise. However, overall bottom line is still up in the air, still not certain, so we'll talk about that. And of course, we'll be referencing the fact that I do write over at geeksandgamers.com, and I have an article I was able to write last night. I was in town for Easter, so a blessed Easter Monday to everyone. Hope everyone had a wonderful Easter weekend. Before we get any further, though, please make sure you smash that like button, light up that fire button over on Odyssey, and smash the rumble button as well. Also, make sure that you're subscribed to the channel with that bell notification. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So I was down in New Orleans for the holiday, got to spend some time with family, a lot of fun. Just drove back this evening, and let's just say I am very, very tired. Kids are down, and let's go ahead and jump into it. So again, over at geeksandgamers.com, I wrote this last night. Godzilla x Kong defies expectations. Though the reviews seem very mixed on the latest MonsterVerse flick, the box office tells a very different story. With a projected domestic opening weekend of $80 million and close to $200 million globally, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, if these numbers hold, will have the second highest grossing domestic opening in the franchise behind the adjusted opening weekend of Godzilla 2014, which made roughly $120 million. And so that's kind of the first point of contention here, is that the film obviously doing very well, but still about $40 million off of where Godzilla 2014 was. Now, these are, of course, using adjusted for inflation numbers because that is going to give us the most fair representation of where this film compares to what the value of the 2014 film actually was. I do, of course, in this article also mention ticket sales, though, because some people get triggered when it comes to inflationary numbers, and so let's talk about that because it tells the same exact story. Again, I don't know why people don't like one over the other. They both tell the same exact story, but I do have it for those that do get triggered by inflation. Looking at estimated ticket sales for the domestic opening, however, the newest MonsterVerse film drops to 3rd place in the franchise. Actually, when you don't look at the inflationary numbers and just look at the ticket sale numbers, it actually ends up not being as great of a story. 3rd place in the franchise with an estimated 6.1 million tickets, which is behind not only Godzilla's 2014 with 11.4 million tickets, but also even Kong Skull Island's 2017 movie, right, with Brie Larson, which had 6.8 million tickets in its opening weekend. So that's, of course, looking at what was the opening weekend numbers and what was the average ticket price at that time domestically. And when you take those things into account, as you can see, $11.4 million is where this franchise started, and this franchise is still only at 6.1. So again, a little less than half of the audience that was originally there for the first film in 2014 have still not shown back up yet for this movie, right? Have still not shown back up yet for this franchise. Now, the correction I do have to make, of course, going into the weekend based on the initial projections was that it looked like this was not going to be recovering at all from the last several movies, which saw a lot less than this, right, by about 2 to 3 million tickets less than this. So the fact that it has gotten back up closer to where the 2017 film Kong Skull Island was at 6.8 million tickets is definitely a good sign. It's definitely a healthy sign. It is still, right, talking about the bottom of this, right? Talking about being towards the bottom end, right? It's again about the halfway point of the franchise, you could say, as far as ticket sales are concerned. So, and there's also the other film in the other two films that it's beat. One of them was a COVID year release, and then the other one, Godzilla versus Kong, I believe was the last one, or maybe I'm thinking of a different one there. Again, regardless of that, though, still third out of the 5 movies that have come out in the MonsterVerse at this point, and so. Again, not as great, I think, on paper as when you see some of the numbers, right? You hear a lot of people out there saying, oh, man, this is the second biggest ever, and blah, 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 blah. It's, again, all that is true, but when you actually break down the numbers themselves, it's impressive, but not as impressive as I think some people are trying to say. Though the newest movie, and I say that here too, though this newest movie is still a far cry from the success of the first, that is just an objective fact, we cannot overlook just how impressive these numbers are after the initial projections had Godzilla x Kong making somewhere between 55 and 65 million. What this film does in the long run remains to be seen, as the domestic week 2 drops for the franchise range from roughly 55% to 68%. So that's a very important metric too, right? If you look at a best case scenario, you had a week 1 to week 2 drop of 55% for the movies in this franchise, with a worst case scenario being in 68%, or in this around 68%, I should say. And so ultimately, all these films lose more than half their audience by the end of their second weekend. And so will we see that for this movie? Again, it still remains to be seen, as I say right here, because of that fact that this movie is not going to have a whole lot of competition. Ghostbusters is flopping, right? Ghostbusters dropped 65% in its second weekend and is not expected to make any money. Expected to be one of the lower money makers of the more recent franchise, which I think is, again, tells you quite a bit about what this movie actually is, despite the fact there have been a lot of just ardent defenders of the movie thinking the film is great. Audience doesn't seem to think the same thing. And again, audiences don't know everything when it comes to whether a film is good or not. Some really great films have lost money in the past. But I do think that when it comes to a movie like this, where typically there's a fan base that comes out to support certain projects like this, if the film actually is good, if it gives fans what they want, we're not really seeing that with this movie. And again, this is not even able to match up to what we saw with a film like Ghostbusters Afterlife. And I think that should also be quite a telltale sign of where this film actually is in the minds of many fans and not just of normies. But I digress. 55% to 68% is what we can expect for a range of where the drop second weekend will be. Now, if it gets lower than that, okay, that's when we're talking about the film probably doing even better than historical projections. But right now, again, we have to, of course, keep all these things in mind. With essentially no major competition expected in the next few weeks, this film could pull in some big numbers. Next week will give us a much more complete picture, and I still stand by that as of today. And then the top 5 for this weekend, Godzilla x Kong New Empire at $80 million as a new release. Ghostbusters did drop 65% in the second week of release. Dune Part 2 still hanging around after 5 weeks, 37% hold. So this film is at the point of being able to make its money back. I have not updated the numbers in my RCC method charting, and so I'll probably do a follow-up article for Geeks and Gamers later this week, looking specifically at Dune Part 2, giving an update on those numbers, just to give you all a better understanding of where that film currently is. But as I mentioned previously, because of where the financials came for that movie, right? Talking about the 25% that was put in by Warner Brothers for the budget, 75% of the budget coming from Legendary. Legendary being owned by a Chinese company means that they get more than the 25% back, but we have no idea what percentage they actually do get back. And so it's kind of a crapshoot. So I'll have probably further analysis of that later this week when I hopefully have some time to do so. Kung Fu Panda 4 came in number 4 spot, a 38% drop in fourth weekend, and Immaculate came in number 5 spot. Now that was as of yesterday. I did try to go to the numbers.com today as of the recording of this video, and it is not loaded. So as you can see, it's still not loading. So if these numbers have changed, again, apologies, but the numbers is currently not working for me. Now, the next film to talk about, though, is Ghostbusters. Man, oh man. So as you all know, I was not a big fan of this movie. I thought that Afterlife was a fine movie. I thought it was fun. It had just the right amount of nostalgia. It had a really great moment at the end where you had this sense of conclusion to the overall story, and it really did not need to go any further than that. There was no need to continue on. The new characters really weren't all that interesting to be able to stand on their own, and they're not even allowed to stand on their own, and I'm kind of glad that they weren't, because then the film would have been even worse than what it actually was, right? So it's not the worst movie that I've ever seen, but it's definitely not a great movie either, right? I put that in that decent, leaning towards bogus category over in my critic list review. And the more that I think about the movie and the more that I just ponder some of the things that happen in the film, I just dislike it more and more, and I have no desire to ever watch it again. And it's looking like the audience is also just not showing up for it, right? Dropping 65%. Now let's go ahead and break down these numbers, because objectively speaking, this is not good for this film. So it says, the debate over whether the latest Ghostbusters film is any good rages on. Personally, I think the film was a bit of a boring mess that really showed why the sequel was unnecessary. The fact is, however, that the box office reporting for the second weekend numbers is not very good. According to my charting, with a projected 65% drop, Ghostbusters Frozen Empire is currently projected to make between 155 to 217 million by the end of its run. So that means that after week 2, it's made $108 million. And so let's say that ends up being 70% of its entire box office. That means it ends at 155. If this ends up being 50% of its box office, meaning it doubles what it's made so far, over the course of its release, then it would get upwards of $217 million. So just as a frame of reference there, that is still going to be a far cry from the previous films that we have seen, and we'll go into that in just a second. This would, of course, not be even taking into account the much more likely scenario that it loses between $50 and $100 million, right? So a best case scenario for this movie is that it loses $20 million, right? So at this point, if it doubles what it's made so far, it still ends up being $20 million in the red, and that's based off a 2.5 multiplier. The fact is that it's probably a lot higher than that because of where this film is making money, because of marketing costs in today's world, because of ever-changing contracts. And if you take that into account, you're looking at probably being closer to $50 to $100 million when everything is said and done. So definitely not going to be an amount of money that's going to be able to be recouped very easily and justified. I don't see how they're able to or will be able to possibly justify any future films in this franchise going forward. Comes to Godzilla, that film is already doing very well. They were able also to get the spending on the latest film to be a lot smaller. It still has a ways to go, right? It's still making a lot more money internationally than it is domestically, but it might be making just enough domestically to actually be one of the more successful films because of that lower budget. Monsterverse has never really been a vastly successful box office franchise. If you actually look at the numbers themselves, right, overall, it's not a billion-dollar franchise, right? None of the individual films have been able to really reach those heights. And then you look at the massive spending they've had and where they've made most of their money. And really, before China took over Legendary, right? Before the Chinese takeover of the company Legendary, you were still getting only 25% returns from China from any of those releases. And now we have no idea how much they get because all we know is the CEO at one point said something to the effect of, hey, we get better than 25%, but they don't actually tell us what that percentage actually is. And so it becomes a bit of a crapshoot. It could be 26% because that's better than 25 technically. Could be 50%. Could be 75%. Again, the Chinese Communist Party is going to take its cut though, and so I can't imagine it's all that much better than 25%. But again, we don't know those numbers at this point in time. While that's going on for the Godzilla franchise, when it comes to both Ghostbusters, right, we're not even talking about that being a possibility for this. Compared to the last two Ghostbusters films, in fact, which include the abominable Ghostbusters 2016, the film is currently tracking about $20 million behind Ghostbusters Afterlife. So at the same point of release, $20 million behind. And over $30 million behind where Ghostbusters 2016 was at the same point of release. And so right now, this film is tracking far behind both of those movies. And ultimately, I do not think that Frozen Empire is going to be able to do anything, right? Whether or not you like the film or not, the objective reality is that the box office is just not showing up for this movie. Now, going to the chart, because we love doing shots here over at OMB Reviews, remember that most films tend to, in their opening weekends, make about 3 times their total global total by the end of their run, right? This is more of an average, right? So this is not a general rule, but let's just say that, Godzilla X Kong has pretty much an average release, right, in the modern world. Then that would mean right now we can project the film $582 million as an end point. That's be pretty good, right? So if it ends at $582 million or even closer to $600 million worldwide, that would mean that it makes money, it's profitable, right? Right now the break even's around $337 million. That's of course using a 2.5 multiplier, so it's actually probably going to be a little bit higher than that, so probably closer to $400+ million to break even, especially when you take into account how much money is being made internationally using that RCC method I tend to use when I take into account the 40% cut from the international markets and the 55% cut from domestic markets and then 25% usual cut from China. You start to realize, okay, the numbers aren't nearly as clear as it might seem. And so right now, though, it's tracking to do very well. The other thing that I mentioned, though, was last week, and I had some people push back on this, I mentioned that the initial projections for this weekend were obviously being a lot lower for Godzilla X Kong versus even that of the last film that released during the pandemic, which made over $200 million. Now, let me go ahead and just pull that up real quick because we love doing things live here on the channel in real time because it keeps me honest. So I had mentioned about Godzilla versus Kong had opened around 285.4. Some people took umbrage with it, saying you're not being fair because it had an early release in China and other markets. Yeah, maybe by 5 days. So again, I see what you're trying to say because you could argue the whole extended release, right? But remember that when it comes to internationals, we usually don't get those numbers until the weekend anyway. And so it's almost as if we had an opening weekend that was just extended in those specific territories. And so I still think overall what you're looking at is a Godzilla vs. Kong worldwide opening of around $285 million with a day-and-date release model. I believe that was the case back in 2021 for that film. And you saw those numbers there, and now you're seeing the film get close to $200 million this time around. Even if you take into account that early release in those other countries, you're still looking at it being, what, the exact same roughly between the two, if you actually like break that down. So I do think that there is still something to be said for what was made, for the point that I made last time, that again, this is still, it's a stronger start than anyone would have expected. There's no doubt about that. And I am definitely going to admit that very fact. But to say that everything is now all good and gravy and that everything is just amazing, as of right now, as of recording this video, we're not seeing that. Now, I do think we'll probably see a stronger hold for this film than we did for the last film, because obviously you had the day and date model going on for that and other factors going on back in 2021 too. So I do think this film will probably leg out a bit more. And so, again, if you do bring up the last Godzilla film, let me just go ahead and see if I can pull that up for a second, because the real one to compare it to will ultimately be the second weekend numbers for that. So by the end of the second weekend, Godzilla vs. Kong was at 357.8. So will this film be able to get to that? I think there's a chance, maybe even getting closer to $400 million worldwide. That's a possibility. But that's ultimately going to tell us where this film ends up, right? So let's say it does get close to that 357, then that will put the range between 511 and 715. I think that would be a doable thing. I think that would be a very likely scenario for the film currently in release in this new Godzilla X Kong. And so I do think that's going to happen. What's not going to happen, though, is Ghostbusters, all right? So this film, after opening 108, as I mentioned in the article, 155 to 217 is the overall projections on what the film's overall box office will be, and that breaks out to be around $56 million to $20 million in losses, currently at around $84 million in losses, and this is not even taking into account that RCC method. So this film objectively not doing well. Godzilla X Kong, though, doing very well. Still has not broken even, right? So it has not gotten to that point yet. Like, the opening was good, but not that good, right? It's very, very, very rare these days that any film would be able to, make its money back or break even in the opening weekend. But let's just say it's off to a very strong start, much stronger than I or anyone else would have expected. However, the start is still not quite to the point of where other films in the franchise have been, right? As I mentioned, this is the third best opening ticket sale-wise domestically. So that's good. They've recovered some ground they lost with the last movie, but the last movie, remember, was day and date, right? They've been able to make up some ground that they've lost since 2017's Kong Skull Island, but they still have a little ways to go if they're going to ever hope to get closer to the heights of Godzilla 2014. And remember, you have to not only look at the average ticket prices, you also have to look at things like inflation to get a better understanding and metric of the comparison between the two. But that's all I have to say because I am tired. What are y'all's thoughts? Do you think that Godzilla X Kong is going to be able to get to $600-700 million? I've heard some people say $1 billion is on the table. I'm sorry, there's just nothing going on right now to suggest that that's going to be the case. Just because there's not going to be competition does not guarantee a film is able to reach those heights, right? A film has to be very, very good, has to have amazing, incredible word of mouth, and has to be able to be something truly special to be able to do that. So lack of competition, that's a factor that can sometimes have an impact, but as we've seen in the past, even good word of mouth on a movie doesn't sell tickets, right? There's a lot of other things that can sometimes go into it. And so I think ultimately, yeah, this film's going to do well. I think the film's going to make its money back, which is a very rare occurrence for a lot of the MonsterVerse films. We actually look at the numbers. But I do think that still, to say $1 billion on the table, I'm sorry, there's nothing here in the numbers to be able to suggest that. The last $1 billion film that we had, I believe, wasn't that Barbie from last year? Let me go ahead and just make sure I can double check my math. Let me go ahead and go through here. Yeah, Barbie was the last $1 billion film that we had. It got to $1.4 billion. That film opened to $344 million worldwide. So this film's not even close to that. This film is not going to have anywhere close to the domestic numbers that Barbie was able to get. This is just not a domestically strong film, right? Franchise, I should say, right? It's going to have most of its money coming from overseas, but it would have to make probably closer to what, $700 to $800 million overseas just to be able to get to the $1 billion. And that's assuming it gets to $200, $300 million domestic. Again, sure, it's possible, but yeah, anyone saying that, I don't think there's a lot of there, and that's mostly, I think, speculation at this point in time. But what are y'all's thoughts? Do you think it's going to be able to do well? Do you think that Frozen Empire, Ghostbusters, is going to pull a miracle and somehow make its money back? Again, it's looking like it's one of the worst performing films in the franchise. I don't have the numbers up right now, though, to be able to say exactly where this film likely will end in comparison to the final numbers for Afterlife versus the final numbers for Ghostbusters 2016. But the fact that it's even, the fact that it's doing worse than the pandemic, quote unquote, pandemic era release of Afterlife, I think says quite a bit about the state of the franchise. But let me know your thoughts about that or anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button, a lot of that fire button, Aussie, smash the rumble button as well. You guys are all amazing, and if beautiful people, have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a huge shout out to all of my Chosen of Valhalla members for the month of March, starting off with Father Luca Illich, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel being Eagle Rider. Miss Mon Muses, check out her YouTube channel as well by the same name. Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name. Mr. Roy and the K-Man, check out the K-Man's website at xtheboundaries.co. If you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, or if you want your name listed at the end of every live stream and video, make sure to check out the top link in the video description on how you can find out where to join on Patreon, Subscribestar, YouTube channel memberships, pretty much anywhere that you can think of that you would have as a mainstream source to be able to support the channel. You have the means to do so, and you get also special perks like having access to an exclusive podcast that I do every single month, access to a giveaways channel that I host on my Discord channel, and also, of course, the ability to have your channel shouted out at the end of every single live stream. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as always, God bless.